What were houses like in the Aztec Empire 600 years ago? For many people, the Aztec world exists only in stone pyramids, warrior costumes, royal palaces, and the great city of Tenochtitlan rising from the lake like a vision. But that image hides the place where life actually happened. What did an ordinary family step onto when they crossed the doorway at the end of a working day? What did they smell when the fire was lit? How did they sleep, cook, bathe, store food, raise children, and make room for several generations inside a world that looked nothing like the modern home? And how different was the house of a farmer, a craftsperson, or a canal worker from the residence of a noble whose walls were white with lime plaster and whose courtyard announced status before a single word was spoken? To enter an Aztec house is to leave behind the empire of monuments and to discover the empire of daily life. Stay until the end, because once you understand these houses, the Aztec world becomes more human and more immediate than most people imagine. The empire was not sustained first by temples, tribute lists, and military campaigns. It was sustained by households, by rooms that held smoke, labor, memory, illness, healing, discipline, and hunger. By spaces where maize was ground before sunrise, where children learned how to move, speak, and obey, where gods were honored not only in vast ceremonial precincts, but at small household altars, and where architecture itself quietly taught every person their place in society. The Aztec Empire was powerful, but power always had to return home at night. And home, for most people, was not grand. It was compact, practical, and alive with constant work. The first surprise is that there was no single Aztec house type. A house in the imperial capital did not feel exactly like a house in a provincial town, and a noble residence did not resemble the dwelling of most commoners. In and around Tenochtitlan, water shaped everything. The city spread across an island in Lake Texcoco, crossed by canals, linked by causeways, supplied by aqueducts, and surrounded by chinampas and reclaimed land. People moved not only on foot, but by canoe. Streets and waterways ran side by side. Some homes opened toward canals and small gardens. In the capital, many houses were low and flat-roofed, while beyond the urban center and across the empire, humbler dwellings were often built from adobe, reeds, wood, and thatch, shaped by local materials and the demands of climate. So when we ask what an Aztec house looked like, the honest answer is this: it depended on where you stood, how much you owned, and who you were allowed to be. For most people, however, the house was small, not empty in the emotional sense, but physically small. One educational summary based on Aztec domestic reconstruction describes the ordinary peasant dwelling as a one-room rectangular hut with an earth floor, a low open doorway, and no chimney or windows. Other summaries note packed earth floors for commoners and the use of adobe brick mixed with straw or rushes, along with wood and straw in the walls and roof. That single room had to absorb the whole rhythm of life. It received the family at dawn and held them again after dark. It did not specialize the way our homes do. It was not divided into a bedroom, kitchen, sitting room, hallway, and storage room. The same enclosure had to serve as shelter, workshop, eating space, resting place, and often the moral center of the household. To modernize, that can seem harsh, but to the people who lived there, it was normal. Life was organized not by excess space, but by habit. And what you felt first inside such a house was not decoration. It was atmosphere. The floor was underfoot, hard and practical. The doorway was low, forcing the body to bow slightly on entering. The absence of windows changed the interior light. Illumination came from the doorway, from fire, and from whatever brightness could be reflected from pale surfaces or the open yard outside. The lack of a chimney meant smoke did not simply disappear upward through a carefully engineered flue. It lingered, drifted, darkened the air, and became part of the interior experience. An Aztec commoner's house was not designed to impress a visitor with openness. It was designed to function. It held warmth, cooking, and family life within a limited shell. That shell could feel close, dim, and smoky, but also enclosed, familiar, and defensible. It was a place that required everyone inside it to know where things belonged and how daily life was supposed to move. One of the deepest mistakes a modern viewer can make is to imagine that a small one-room house meant a disorganized life. In reality, such a home demanded discipline. The basic Nahua commoner household unit has been described in scholarship as a kali, a single-roomed house that opened onto a patio. That detail matters. The house was not always an isolated box standing alone in emptiness. It was often part of a domestic arrangement that extended outward into a yard or patio where work, movement, and interaction could continue. Aztec households were also often larger than the modern nuclear family ideal. Britannica's educational materials describe Calpulli as groupings of dozens to several hundred extended family households, and another summary notes that an Aztec extended family household could include a married couple, their married sons, or the husband's brothers and their families. That means the house was not simply a container for two parents and a child or two. It belonged to a broader social organism. The home was intimate, yes, but it was also collective. That collective life changed the meaning of space. Privacy, as modern people expect, it was limited. A house did not promise every person a separate room, a separate schedule, or a separate sphere. The household was a lived hierarchy. Elders, adults, youths, and small children all had to move around one another. People learned not to treat space as personal property, but as shared order. The patio, yard, and nearby domestic surroundings relieved some of the pressure of the single room, but they also extended the demands of work. In such a world, children did not grow up merely being told what responsibility was. They saw it every day. They saw the room prepared and cleared, tools set down and picked up, food handled with care, water brought in, fire managed, and the household kept in motion through repeated tasks. The architecture did not flatter individuality. It trained participation. A poorly ordered home was not just unpleasant. It slowed the work that kept everyone alive. At the center of that life stood the hearth, not a modern stove hidden behind metal and control knobs, but a more elemental arrangement. Mexicolore's educational material on Aztec domestic objects describes an Aztec hearth as 3 stones supporting the camali, the clay griddle on which maize tortillas were cooked. A comparative study of cooking hearths likewise notes that the 3-stone hearth is illustrated for the Aztecs in the 16th century Florentine Codex. This was not a minor detail. It means the center of the home was a structure of heat, balance, and rhythm. Fire sat low, close to the ground. The griddle rested above it. The smell of warmed maize, smoke, ash, and clay would have defined the house at mealtimes. The labor of food did not begin when something was served. It began with tending flame, heating stone, and managing the small zone where raw staple food became life for the household. And around that hearth, the daily work of women especially became visible, repetitive, and indispensable. Food preparation in the Aztec world was not casual. One of the oldest and most enduring artifacts of Mexican domestic life is the metate, the grinding stone used to prepare staple foods such as corn tortillas. In practical terms, that means a great deal of nourishment had to pass through human hands before it ever reached the comal. Grain had to be processed. Dough had to be formed. Heat had to be judged by experience, not by numbers. Household arts and weaving were so central in Aztec thought that even a goddess, Xochiquetzal, was described as overseeing weaving and household arts. Inside the house then, labor was not background noise. It was the architecture of survival. The family ate because someone spent long hours bent toward stone, clay, heat, and fiber. The empire's public glory rested on private repetition. This is where the Aztec house becomes most human. It was not simply a shelter against the weather. It was a machine for turning effort into continuity. The room held meals, but also weaving, mending, storing, planning, and resting. The patio or yard helped carry the overflow of life beyond the doorway. Nearby there might be domestic animals, small garden plots, tools, baskets, or materials for craft work. In Tenochtitlan, even lower-class homes could be interspersed with small gardens, while workshops clustered in dense urban zones where people worked reeds, basketry, obsidian, and other materials. So the Aztec home should not be imagined as sealed off from production. It was part of production. It was one of the places where the economy of empire became ordinary motion. Hands working fiber, food being made, objects repaired, goods prepared for use or exchange. The household was never merely consuming life. It was constantly making it. But there was another domestic feature that reveals how different Aztec life could be from our own. Bathing. Many modern people imagine pre-modern houses as dirty by default, as if cleanliness were a luxury unknown to earlier civilizations. That assumption fails badly in the Aztec case. Sources on Nahua Health and Sanitation note the high value placed on cleanliness, and Mexicolor explains that Mesoamerican steam rooms were attached to houses and used both for daily bathing and for health. Another summary preserves the striking line that almost every dwelling had its bathhouse, a little low structure used for steam bathing. National Geographic's reporting on Aztec childbirth describes the temazcal as a kind of low-roofed sauna located just outside the home, used with special firewood and aromatic plants. This changes the whole feel of the domestic world. The house was not only where people ate and slept, it was where they purified themselves, where healing practices entered family life, and where the boundary between hygiene, medicine, and ritual became thin. Imagine the physical intimacy of that. Just outside or near the dwelling stood a rounded enclosed steam structure with a low doorway. Fire heated the system from outside or beside it. Steam rose within. Heat entered the body slowly and completely. This was not an occasional luxury retreat. It belonged to the domestic landscape. It could be used for bathing, for treatment, for recovery, and, in some cases, in connection with childbirth. National Geographic notes that as birth approached, the midwife prepared a steam bath in the temazcal, and that orderliness and cleanliness were taken seriously in Aztec society. So the house did not simply contain life at its easiest moments. It also stood beside life at its most vulnerable: pain, weakness, exhaustion, transition, recovery. To understand an Aztec home is to understand that health itself had architecture. Warmth, steam, enclosure, and the body's renewal all had their place near the household center. Religion also entered the house quietly. We often picture Aztec religion only in relation to great temples, towering stairways, priestly ceremony, and imperial spectacle. Yet Britannica notes that much of Aztec religion was probably practiced at home at special household altars, and that common archaeological finds include small baked clay idols or figurines, and incense burners used in household ceremonies. This means the domestic sphere was not spiritually neutral. The house had sacred corners. It had places where the family turned toward the divine within the same environment where food was prepared and children were corrected. The public temple represented the grandeur of the gods and the state. The household altar represented continuity, protection, devotion, and the spiritual responsibilities of ordinary life. The empire did not only worship upward in pyramids, it also worshipped inward, in rooms small enough to fill with smoke from both hearth and incense. And then, of course, there was status. Not every Aztec house asked the same things of the body. Not every doorway opened into the same air. Wealth, privilege, and law altered architecture. Britannica notes that most houses in Tenochtitlan were low and flat-roofed, but that many elites lived in two-story dwellings. Educational and scholarly summaries add that noble homes were made of stone and whitewashed plaster, with stuccoed walls, and that some were organized around courtyards. One Mexicolor summary even notes that ordinary houses had packed earth floors, whereas nobles' houses could have 2 floors raised on a platform. Another source on Aztec law notes that commoners could be punished severely for building a second story, a reminder that architecture itself could be restricted by rank. Height, material, finish, and layout were not merely technical choices. They announced permission. A noble lived not only in more space, but in more authorized space. This difference would have been visible even before one stepped inside. A commoner's house, especially in rural settings, often relied on adobe, wood, reeds, and straw, with the practical simplicity of a sloping gabled roof. A noble residence could rise in more durable stone, finished with whitewashed plaster that reflected light and projected care, cost, and command. Some elite homes had courtyards, multiple rooms, muraled or stuccoed interiors, and a more formal internal order. In a society as stratified as the Aztec world, building materials were not just materials. They were social signals hardened into walls. White plaster could say what a spoken title did. A courtyard could separate the household from the street and convert mere shelter into controlled space. A second level could elevate not only the body, but the family's place within the hierarchy of the empire. The house became a legal statement about who one was allowed to be seen as. Even so, The difference between homes was not simply one of comfort versus discomfort. It was a difference in vulnerability. A better-built house endured weather more reliably. Better materials resisted decay. Plastered walls and floors were easier to clean and more impressive to guests. A courtyard created breathing room. More rooms created more control over noise, rank, and movement. A common household could still be orderly, functional, and dignified, but it lived closer to the pressure of limits. Less storage meant less margin. A smaller room meant more friction. More smoke meant more strain on eyes and lungs. Less durable construction meant more maintenance and less permanence. In this sense, inequality was not an abstract principle. It was felt in heat, in crowding, in the persistence of labor, and in how much a family could protect itself from the daily wearing down of life. The house was where social class became physical. Yet one of the most fascinating truths is that, despite these inequalities, Aztec domestic architecture still reveals an extraordinary practicality at every level. Tenochtitlan itself was a city whose order astonished the Spaniards. Canals reached homes. Drawbridges, dikes, and aqueducts sustained urban life. Waste management and cleanliness drew historical admiration. This larger civic intelligence shaped the meaning of home. A house was not a private island cut off from infrastructure. It participated in a much larger system of water, movement, land reclamation, and neighborhood organization. The Calpulli gave households a communal framework. Land could be distributed through these units, and neighborhoods had their own institutions. So the Aztec home was both intimate and embedded. It belonged to a family, but also to a ward, to a social order, to a water-managed city, to a tribute empire, and to a cosmos in which even domestic rights mattered. The home was small, but it was not isolated. It was tied into a world far larger than itself. That may be the most important shift in perspective. We tend to think that power lives at the top, in palaces, temples, and official buildings. But 600 years ago, Aztec power also lived at ground level. It lived in the woman leaning over the metate before daylight, in the low doorway that forced the body to stoop as it entered, in the 3 stones of the hearth, in the clay griddle, in the steam bath beside the house, in the little altar where figurines and incense marked domestic devotion, in the patio where work spilled outward from the room, in the discipline required to share space without surrendering structure. If we only study Aztec pyramids, we learn what the empire wanted to proclaim. If we study Aztec houses, we learn what the empire depended on. And what it depended on was not spectacle. It was routine. So what were houses like in the Aztec Empire 600 years ago? They were smaller than most modern viewers expect and more sophisticated in their social meaning than many imagine. For commoners, they were often one-room dwellings with earth floors, low doorways, and little separation between functions. They opened onto patios, belonged to wider family networks, and centered life around hearth, labor, and shared order. In the capital and among elites, houses could rise in stone and plaster, with flat roofs, courtyards, and even second stories reserved for those of rank. Many homes stood near water, gardens, or canals. Many had access to steam baths. Many included sacred domestic spaces. These were not accidental shelters. They were structures shaped by law, class, environment, and the demands of daily survival. They taught people how to live because they gave them no room to forget that living itself was work. And that is why these houses still matter. Because once you step inside them, the Aztec Empire stops being only a story of conquest and grandeur and becomes a story of human beings managing heat, smoke, water, status, family, belief, and exhaustion inside spaces that had to carry everything. The empire may be remembered for what rose high above the ground, but ordinary life was shaped much lower, in the rooms where people bent, cooked, washed, stored, slept, argued, obeyed, recovered, and began again. To understand those houses is to understand that civilization is not built only by monuments, it is built by households that endure. And in the Aztec world, endurance had walls of adobe or stone, floors of earth or plaster, air scented with smoke or steam, and a door low enough to remind every person who entered that home was never just a place. It was the discipline of life itself.